Unit 9 Introduction to Neoclassical Drama. After the Renaissance, a period of exploration and expansiveness, came a reaction in the direction of order and resistance. In generally speaking, this reaction developed in France in the mid 17th century and in England 30 years later, and it dominated European literature until the last part of the 18th century. Almost all the writers turned from inventing new words to regularizing their vocabulary, grammar form, which is complex, boldly metaphorical language, which is used by Shakespeare in his major tragedies. This ideal style is lucid, polished, and precisely appropriate to the genre of a work and the social position of its characters. Tragedy and high comedy for exhausting feeble and more conventional figure of speech. The crude humor of grave diggers in Hamlet or the pulling out of Gloucester's eye in King Lear would no longer be admitted in tragedy. This period is called neoclassical because the influence of the classics, its writers looked back to the ideals and art form of classical times, emphasizing even more than their Renaissance predecessors the classical ideas of orders and rational control. The respect for the lost led them to the conservative in both art and politics. They are aware of the conventions appropriate to each genre. They modeled their works on classical masterpiece and headed the rules thought to be laid down by classical critics. They were guided by the wisdom of the past. Traditional institutions had at least survived the test of time. No more than their medieval and Renaissance predecessors did. Neoclassical thinkers share their modern assumption that changes means progress. It was better to set a moderate goal, whether in art or society, and achieve it well. Neoclassical assumptions and their implications. They started thinking that past as a guide for them to lead the present because they assumed that human nature was constant, essentially the same regardless of time and place. An individual character was valuable for what he or she revealed of universal human nature. Johnson made his statement about Shakespeare, but neoclassical artists more consciously emphasized common human characteristics over the individual differences. If human nature has remained constant over centuries, it is unlikely that any startling new discoveries will be made. As Alexander Pope, one of the greatest poets, writes, true wit is nature to advantage dressed. What of was thought but never so well expressed. It applicable to neoclassical writers who aimed to articulate general truth rather than unique vision, to communicate to other more than to express themselves. Neoclassical writers saw themselves as their readers and characters above all as members of society. The individual who rebelled against custom or asserted his superiority to man humankind was alike presented as presumptuous and absurd. Romantic artists often glorified them as neoclassical artists for individual opinions because they developed over time and embodied in custom and tradition. They prescribed their own rules for proper writing should be followed So, should the rules for civilized conduct in society. The classical ideals of order and moderation which inspired this period, which gave the name the age of the reason. Reason had traditionally been assumed to be the highest mental faculty, but in this period, many thinkers considered it a sufficient guide in all areas. Neoclassical art is not meant to seem a spontaneous outpouring of emotion or imagination. The misanthrope, for example, is focused on its theme more consistently than or any of Shakespeare's play. Neoclassicism covers the period from the end of the English Renaissance in 1642 to the culmination of the French Revolution and beheading of Louis the 16th in 1793. In particular, Philip IV of Spain extended his powers to Central and South Africa. Charles II of England returns from French exile and is restored to the English throne in 1660s. The life of the French royal and the accompanying court life were both highly structured and opulent. So the life of the Louis the 13th and the 14th continued in the years to come. The French court was busy place. With the exile of Charles II and his family, there were two courts in France. Furthermore, while the exiled Charles II enjoyed the French court life and its entertainment, upon his return to England, Charles brought theatre back to his own country. Theatre during the early royal period in France took place in hotels and jeux de paume or tennis court that had been converted to stages. The royal period is recognized by its opulent fashions and taste. The actors just helped focus everybody's attention. The theatres presented the royal palace along with the comedy and tragedy. These new and improved masks used the traditional allegories, themes, and the combination of dance, drama, and music with both actors and courtiers, combined with even more fantastical sets of costume. Plays were either tragedies or comedies. There were no combined forms. In addition, all acceptable plays were to follow five-act structures. Characters are not unduly punished without a fair trial, and all the characters represented fairly as having both good and bad traits. It is interesting to note that France's premier playwright Molière continually challenged the rules of neoclassical drama, risking both imprisonment and bankruptcy. It is apparent that during the royal period, as all in other eras, theatres reflects the prevailing political, social, philosophical, and religious values of the time. But interestingly, it is not only reflects these influences through the content of the play, but also in the physical structures, of the theatre, in the organizational system of companies themselves. And these are the key words which help you to understand the technical terms which are used in the text. And these three are the terminal questions. Thank you.